Hello, welcome to a new edition of Talking About EAL. Today we will be talking about social justice and literacies with Dr. Yvonne Foley. Yvonne is the chair of NALDIC, and before we invite her to join the conversation, a few words about Yvonne. To say that she has worked as a teacher and teacher educator for many years in the field of English as an additional language, both in Taiwan and across the UK, an experience that we're looking forward to asking her about. She taught for a number of years as an EAL teacher and EAL coordinator in the American schooling system before moving back to the UK to take up a position as a teacher educator at the University of Edinburgh. It'll be interesting to ask Yvonne about the various teacher educator programs that she teaches at and how she includes the issues of social, cultural and linguistic diversity in her role. These are in fact Yvonne's research and teaching interests. Hello to everybody joining us. Yvonne is actually interested in the ways in which critical approaches to literacies can be implemented in classroom practices to ensure that both teachers and pupils recognize that there is more than one language, more than one history, culture, identity, geography, and ideology across the world. Yvonne tells us that she very much enjoys working with both pre- and in-service teachers to explore how to develop professional identities and practices that recognize and respond to the learning needs of all pupils, particularly those from linguistically and culturally diverse backgrounds. I'm sure that we're all keen to hear Yvonne's ideas on all these interesting and complex issues. Yes, Yvonne, here you are. Let me see if I can ask you to join. I see you there. Yvonne, see as an alternative, if you can send me. Yes, there we go.
There you go.
Hello there.
Hi there.
Was that all going through? All the introductory? Yes, yes.
Yep, I
Was it
could
all
hear
correct? Tell me if
Yep.
any of that was wrong or inaccurate.
No, that was all right.
Right. Well, it's so good to see you. We're finally here.
We are. It's lovely to see you too.
Tell us where you are to start with. I'm in La Plata, Argentina.
All right. Well, I'm in the Scottish borders in a place called Skirling, which is a really small village, but really enjoy living here. It's out in the country.
Right. Rather cold, I imagine, already
Yeah, we get
nighttime for
lots
you
of
there.
snow. Lots of snow, but we're close enough to Edinburgh and Glasgow for easy commute to work and things. So it's ideal.
Right, right, right. So, Yvonne, would you like to start by telling us a little bit about your background and your history with NALDIC, which I understand goes back quite a long way?
Yeah. It sure does. Yeah, I think I've always wanted to be a teacher for as long as I can remember, but opportunities didn't come my way earlier in my life, and so I took it on after I had my own children, and so I went and did. I was originally in a TESOL context for teaching, and that involved me teaching in further education in schools in Taiwan, and also linking with lots of other communities. But after a while, I really had wanted to teach in schools, and so I looked at how I could make a route into schools for working with pupils learning English as an additional language. And the American school there was an international school, and they had 3 different campuses. So I went in to teach there as a new kind of newbie teacher, and was mentored through the school like you would be on your PGDE or your PGCE as it is in England, and did my master's through, it was a kind of alternative route to teaching. And so I did master's by distance, and then I also did teaching in school, which helped me to become a teacher, which was great. It was everything I'd wanted to do. So I learned the American curriculum, taught across the international schools, and then had the opportunity then to become the EAL coordinator. And that was because of my own TESOL background, my knowledge of linguistics and language and culture. And so we started off with 2 students that we had initially in the school, and that grew to 150 within a few years. And so we kind of we just opened to the community as a school, and we were able to bring in lots of children. So it wasn't an international school that was kind of elite. It was working within the community, and it was really good. And I learned a lot there from the students. So the EAL coordinator role was over 3 schools, and they were placed in different parts of the island in Taiwan. They were all American schools. And that's where I learned to teach, basically, and I grew in my own knowledge and development there. But after 15 years, we came back to live in the UK because our own children needed to go to university. And so we made that transition back into a UK context. And when I came back here with my family, I got a job at the University of Edinburgh as a teacher educator and teacher trainer also. And so we settled back in the UK, which was great for us. But I was desperate to find something linked to EAL, and I kept thinking they must have students in schools that are diverse in the UK, but I didn't hear anybody talk about it in education. So that worried me a little bit. But eventually I found NALDIC online. And when I found them, I thought, oh, I must go to this conference that's been advertised. So I turned up at the conference, and I've been here ever since. It was just like I found my home. I suddenly thought, here's people that are like-minded. They work in schools with EAL pupils and with teachers, EAL coordinators. And so it was just a place that I felt at home immediately, and met some really good people that I worked with in NALDIC, and they helped. They take you along on a journey too, that we all learn together with each other. So that's basically how I came into NALDIC, and that's a little bit about my background.
That's so interesting to hear. Also, how our personal and family life always finds itself weaving itself into everything else we do, right?
It does, it does.
Yeah, yeah. And we were saying in the last conversation that we had with Christina Richardson and Fiona Ranson, who work on the EAL journal, as you know, how many of us that end up working in EAL sometimes come from other backgrounds, either general teaching or language or English as a subject. And I was wondering, how was that passage for you, with your initial training as in TESOL, and then arriving at EAL and the work as a teacher, and then as a coordinator, and now teacher educator? How did you put together all those experiences for the kind of professional that you are today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think the road is easy to get into EAL, and I found it more difficult in the British system than I did in the American, because the American system seemed a little bit more open to different routes to teaching. But when I came back to the UK, I was, just metaphorically speaking, I found there were borders everywhere, like gatekeepers that didn't want anybody that was different or had a different teaching experience to enter into the Scottish school context is what it was when I was up here. And so I found it quite difficult. I had to keep, saying, no, I actually am a teacher, and I've just come through a different route. So it took quite a while to be able to understand the different expertise and different routes into teaching for that. But I think when I joined NALDIC, I found like-minded people, because as you say, we've all come to EAL, even those working in schools from very different routes. And so was able to kind of get support and knowledge of how to navigate the system. Don't know if that answers your question, actually.
It does, because as a person that also comes from a TESOL background, I'm surprised to see that, to some extent, with such a diverse population, student population, as there is in a country like England and the UK in general, that to some extent there aren't more training options, and that there aren't initial teacher education or teacher training options but rather it seems to be a sort of postgraduate kind of degree or studies that every EAL professional has to undergo.
Yeah.
And
Well, actually,
I was, yeah, sorry.
I was sorry. I was just thinking when you said that, because up here, Scotland has just started a 2-year master's program for initial teacher education. And what has happened on that, they've looked at the diversity of teachers and who can contribute. And so I was able then to be appointed to take on the core literacies course. So you've got all the teachers that will go into schools and do their initial teacher training. And I've constructed the literacies course around diversity and transformative learning and teaching. So the whole course has an EAL focus, but it's more than EAL. It takes all of literacy education and brings it into the 21st century in a sense, by making it a diverse approach. So that's been really good.
That's so nice to hear. Is that at the University of Edinburgh, did you say?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. The master's that I did myself a few years ago, which is bilingualism and education, it's basically not available anymore at the University of Birmingham, and that was one of the other options related to EAL and more, as you say. So, well, I'm glad to see that you've got another option too, up in Edinburgh. I've seen that the link between language and identity was something that you explored probably earlier than that, but I saw that in your experience in Taiwan, you looked into the relationship between, I don't want to mispronounce the language, is it Daigi, or I don't know exactly how it's pronounced, and that you looked at how Daigi was also being to some extent overtaken by Taiwanese Mandarin generation after generation. I was wondering if that's your if your initial interest in linking language and identity grew strong there, or whether you were looking at that link from before your experience in Taiwan.
Yeah, no, that's a good question too. I think the DAI was because one of my PhD students here actually explored that link, but mine goes further back in Taiwan when my husband wanted to work. He works for a charity, but he wanted to work in an area where people spoke Hakka Chinese, and everybody said to him, "Oh, don't go near that language. Learn Mandarin because that's the language of education." But he just felt he wanted to represent that language in some way in that community, so he learned Hakka. It took him ages to find a teacher, and everybody that he met that was Hakka Chinese said, "Oh, you speaking our heart language. This is who we are, it's our identity." And by the time we left after 14 and a half years, they used to call him Hakka. And so they gave him that identity before he left, because he had learned the language and integrated into the community in a way that they felt was particularly important to them. It gave them a sense of representation amongst all the other kind of charities that were there. So that was where it started. And then my PhD student also was looking at Taiwanese Mandarin overtaking Taiwanese as a language. But that's now, the government there is now recognizing that these two languages, Hakka and Taiwanese, are important to community life and also as part of their history and identity. So they're now teaching that in schools. But it's almost like our MFL approach, where it's learned as a foreign language. It's that type of approach rather than the language of education.
I understand. Yeah. And comparing your experiences, you were talking today about, what happened to you when you arrived in the UK, having been in Taiwan, and that's where you worked in, you said, international schools, basically following the American curriculum. What lessons would you say you took home with you? How did the British system strike you, having been in that international context back in Taiwan?
I think the whole kind of concept of identity was something that I carry with me still. And I take that away from my international school experience, because within those schools, everybody was aware of difference, and you were respectful to other cultures, other nationalities, other ways of being, other languages. And that was built into the ethos of the schools that I was teaching in. And I also found Taiwan as a country also had a very diverse and integrative approach. But so I would say that I took that with me. And when my children were growing up there, they went to the school I taught in, actually, but they learned Chinese, and we lived in a Chinese community. So they'd grown up their whole life there. And when we came back here, they felt like nobody understood them and didn't understand the cultural references that they were making, because they'd had an American schooling in Taiwan. And so they didn't understand their backgrounds or the kind of movies that they would watch, or, just cultural references, basically, and even different vocabulary that they used. And so that whole sense of identity coming into the educational experience was something that I took to heart, because my son told me a story once, and I told him I use this story whenever I work with student teachers. But he came home from school one day when he was here, because he did a year of school in high school here. And he said to me, "Is it a special book in the UK that everybody reads and knows about, and it's got a special page 3?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." And then he said, "Well, my teacher said that the guy in this book that we're reading at school is a page 3 reader, and everybody knows what it means except me." And so I had to then explain that it was the Sun newspaper, and that why page 3 was important. But that whole cultural gap for somebody that spoke English as their first and home language was something that I suddenly thought, this is what used to happen when my students in Taiwan, the texts that they were reading did not have the same cultural frames of reference or things that they could understand. And so I brought back from there that texts that we use in class have to represent the pupil population that we work with. Otherwise, we're hindering their success when they engage with texts, whether it's in speaking, writing, or reading, whatever it is. And so I became very aware of that. And my children now, well, they're adults now, but they still see themselves as Taiwanese, Scottish, and then their dad's Irish, so they feel quite mixed up sometimes. But that whole thing of identity and cultural background and cultural understanding in text is something I brought back with me.
I always find it striking how every researcher that I speak to either, has something in their personal story that either ignites or pushes forward the academic interests that they've got. A topic that I'm interested in and that I do some work on is translanguaging, and to see how many of the authors are themselves embodiments of a bicultural and multilingual contexts, and how they've sometimes had to suffer the negative consequences of context where multilingualism is not championed, and where there's maybe a subtractive notion of bilingualism, and that I think is an inevitable link maybe between our personal stories and the academic interests that we pursue, I suppose.
Yeah, it's very true.
Well, coming to the topic that we agreed upon for the title of this conversation, which involves literacy, can we talk a little bit about why we use literacies in the plural, what the word critical adds to literacies when we speak of critical literacies for inclusion as well? What does that all mean?
Yeah, I guess literacy initially or traditionally was always seen as being able to read and write. And I think that's a very Western approach to how we define literacy. But a lot of research was done, and they looked at different ethnographic studies that showed how living in communities that people had oral cultures, and they were literate in their oral culture, very different to how we were describing what it should look like in the West. And so there was recognition after lots of research that there were a number of different literacies that people carry with them and are able to engage in. And it became that they were described as a set of social practices and sets of things that we do within social and cultural contexts. And also that people bring different types of knowledges in the plural to the learning process. It's not just one type of literacy that's there. And those literacies can be, I mean, we've heard of all the digital literacies, we've heard of oral literacies, and there's also transcultural literacies. So there's lots of different ways of being and doing in the world that we bring to the learning process and how we engage in literacy. And all those types of things influence the fact that it's a pluralized concept rather than just this singular way that you can only speak and write in this way. And that means that we can measure it easily because we like to do that. We like to count things in our education system. So this kind of helps us to see that knowledge is plural and it's not always Western.
The critical reason why we add, critical. That's what I was going to ask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the critical dimension, I think, is something I learned in Taiwan, because I think learning or living overseas made me into a better person. It helped me to recognize my own unconscious bias and how I viewed the world, and I was able to learn that people viewed the world very differently to me, and that helped me to be a better person, I think. But the critical dimension came in through my students. They started saying, well, that's what you think in the West, and what we think here is this. And so they would say, well, why is this person not speaking in the video or the movie or whatever it was we were engaged in? Why is this person's dad not part of the story? And I started to think about those practices myself, and it was through engaging with students as they talked to me, because I was eager to find out what their ways of viewing things were. That's what I always wanted to know before we got into any kind of analysis of an educational text. And so the critical dimension was linked to notions of power for me, because I was aware that within the school that I was in, because it was obviously Western in its curriculum, but there were instances where I had to really challenge the status quo. And that was because they had, in one of the schools I was overseeing, they had what they call a no Mandarin policy. And that meant they couldn't speak their home language in the school, that everything had to be in English. And so that really bothered me, because that links to identity, it links to equity, it links to the learning process, because if you can't figure things out in the repertoire of languages you're hindering that process. So had to challenge that as an EAL coordinator, which wasn't easy, because I was a Brit telling an American school system what I thought. And then they had this term, I'm sure you're familiar with it, it's LEP. And they were called Limited English Proficient Students. And I absolutely hated that term because it was so negative. And so changing perceptions around that, pushing for a different label, because there's labels, everybody's labeled, was something that I saw in that kind of whole power structure within education, whether it was curricular or whether it was the systemic kind of structure of education and labels that we give. And so I started to step out and be more of an advocate for the pupils that I worked with. But then we also brought that into the texts that we use. So I guess it's a learning process as you grow up. I mean, I was quite young then, but as you grow up yourself, you start to see this is what's happening in the world. And in Taiwan, China was always threatening to invade, and so there was always this kind of dialogue amongst the community around issues of power. So I learned about it there, and then when I came back to do my own work in the university, that grew, and it helps me then to think about how we look at texts that we get involved with our students, how we dialogue around those, where are the injustices within those types of texts, who's got the power in them, whose voice is represented, whose voice is missing, who's represented in the pictures of the books, and I think it was out of 23,000 children's books, there was only a very small percentage represented children of colour. And so all those types of things came into my interest, and because I'm an activist at heart, that was the route that I pursued in my PhD.
I can see that. And there's a phrase that you use that I love. I don't know whether to call it your personal motto or what. The song of justice must be sung.
Yeah.
And now I'm beginning to understand more and more why that phrase resonates in everything you do, and also the fact that you mentioned words like invade and war, and well, I can't help but think of so many questions that come to mind with what we've been going through in the past a few weeks at the present time. I was wondering, how do you manage to include this perspective of social justice on the various teacher education programs that you participate in at the University of Edinburgh?
Well, we were able, out of my own PhD, I was able to birth a course on our PGCE program that students opt into, and it's multidisciplinary, so students from all subject areas can come. And the whole year then on that course is them going on a journey with me, learning about how to support pupils coming in from very different cultural and linguistic backgrounds to what the mainstream norm is supposed to be. And so that course runs all year, and I work with those students, and then on the master's program that's 2 years on the literacies course. And so I feel like there's a real kind of ethos within those programs to push the social justice agenda forward. And they're taking more and more research that we're doing linked to EAL into their curriculum, and also looking at decolonization as a whole university. So the whole aspect or concept of difference rather than diversity is something that they're looking at. And those critical aspects that I've just been talking about, when you start looking at decolonizing the curriculum and what that might mean, all those questions of power come in, and the students pick that up and they run with it. Those student teachers want to know this. They want to understand and challenge the world they're living in. They want a better world for themselves and for their children, and also for their students. And so we work on the literacies program across the different ITE programs, as we call them. But it looks at issues of equity and representation, in terms of texts, who we're representing when we choose texts within the school, or what other texts we bring in to look at. And I'm not just talking about written texts, I'm talking about multimodal texts. In fact, education itself is a text. If we look to kind of, consider that and analyze it. But the students themselves are looking at, they become aware of what's a Western perspective. And I don't want to have a false dichotomy there between West and East, but they're looking at how the West has taken certain messages and said, this is the only way that you can be literate. And they're then exploring what literacy means when there's multiple knowledges in the world, how that helps to make the world a better place. And we can see that even now, just looking at the news, when, there's polarized positions. So young people and children learning about critical literacy really young is something that actually helps to make a better world, because there's more understanding of each other, more understanding of where the power issues are. So that's a little bit linked to the social justice that we explore on the programs and the courses.
I was interested when you emphasized the word multimodal, and how multimodality might be a way maybe to reach not only younger generations, but I was wondering, because you talked about your own experience living in Taiwan, and I was wondering how you do the job as a teacher educator with teachers in training that might not necessarily have lived abroad, who may be surrounded by a certain amount of diversity where they live, but they may not have had that direct experience of a person like you actually having that hard experience of, living right next to the prejudices and the contrasts that surely jump at you when you live in a context which is very different from where you come from. So is the multimodal approach maybe one of the ways in which you actually manage to have the younger generations of future teachers involved in these ideas and actually for them to become engaged in the whole question of equity and social justice?
Yeah, because there's lots you can draw on in a multimodal sense to help you as a teacher to look at your own values and beliefs, and then to link with others that come from very different contexts that will have a different worldview. And so that helps to kind of reshape or challenge your own perspectives. I think more needs to be done on that on ITE programs in the UK, across the UK, because I think that we don't get enough experience with our teachers for them to experience other cultures and languages. And that would be something I think that could be built into a much better experience for them.
Mm. I was checking out an article you wrote some time ago on in the book on teacher education. Yes, I Googled you about the changing demographics of schooling, and I think the fact that the article the title is so complete, and I'm going to read it out. How effectively are mainstream teachers prepared to meet the needs of learners for whom English is an additional language? What was your insight back then, and what do you think about that today? How effectively are actually mainstream teachers to meet the needs of EAL pupils?
Yeah, well, the word mainstream in itself is problematic, isn't it? But so the one question I always say to the teachers is, who do you want to be? What kind of teacher do you want to be? Because often the structure of our education system is geared towards monolingualism and producing monolingual students. And a lot of it is very much westernized focus for white middle class students. And so trying to bring in diversity to the core of ITE is one of the things that we kind of pushed for on those types of research projects that we were looking at. And what we found across England, because we did a big survey in England with ITE and then also up here in Scotland, was that student teachers feel they get minimal, if any, support in knowing how to support EAL students. So that was one of the reasons I started the course up here. But also looking as NALDIC to get involved in more training, supporting teachers and schools to attend those types of things for professional learning experiences is really important. But the ITE program, we're seeing a lot of difference up here. Scotland's always trying to punch above its weight as a country. It's a small place, but it likes to think it's pushing the boundaries on education, and in some ways it is. And so that's why this course or this program that we've been able to put together is trying to address transformative teaching and learning where diversity is at the core. But that needs to kind of be rolled out across ITE as, across the whole of the UK, so that we've got those perspectives coming in for students right at the very beginning, that everything they learn is not just from one worldview. And then it becomes sensitized then to how they teach language, what language looks like to them, how do they understand language and culture. And so all those reflective beliefs or beliefs that they hold and values they carry are something that needs to be opened. And we've found a lot of the students themselves take us forward with that because they're eager to learn about that.
Yeah. I was wondering, it's a bit difficult maybe to give concrete examples of such broad issues, but if we talk about literacies for diversity, are there any tips or examples of materials, ways in which teachers can approach their planning, taking into account the idea of literacies for diversity?
Yeah. So one of the things that we do with the student teachers that they've tried in their classes, and we've also tried these activities in the US as well, and they've worked really well with teachers, is if anybody that's watching this tonight wants to get in touch, I can send them through all the kind of graphic organizers that we look at and use. But vocabulary is one of the things all teachers say, oh, I need to know how to teach this properly. And one of the books that I use with the students is called What's in a Word? And actually, I'll just hold it up there so you can see What's in a Word. And it's by Nora McWilliam. And it's got loads of activities for developing vocabulary. It helps you to understand the importance of vocabulary and what it does, how it links, how it's used within discourses, etc. So it's a really good book with practical activities. But one of the things that we explore with them when we're looking at vocabulary is the stories that we carry in our head that are linked to words. And those will be different depending on where we come from in the world. So the example of my son with knowing what a page 3 reader meant. And then there's the word war. If that was a vocabulary word for primary, somebody coming from Ukraine into our Scottish or English school context would have a very different story and understanding or connotation to the word than somebody who's grown up in a very safe environment that has never experienced terror or having to flee their country. And so all those stories are important when it comes to interpretation of a text, whether that's an oral text or multimodal. And an example in schools with one of the pupils I spoke to, he was from a Chinese background, and he said that he had failed one of the close reading passages. He'd answered all the questions about a character that was in the story, and he got them all wrong. But he actually understood the words in the passage, but he had misinterpreted the word that was a key theme in the story, and that was the word adventurous. And the character in the story was adventurous, but he applied his own cultural and world knowledge to that. And in the Chinese context, if you're adventurous, it means you're putting your family at risk, you're putting them at risk of loss, because you're taking risks that they might end up losing a child or a family member. And so he interpreted the whole story around saying that the character was a bad, son, and he shouldn't have put his mother and family through that. Whereas in the Western perspective, I guess we tend to think being adventurous is a very individualistic thing, and we think, oh, it's great, you go out there and you make your mark as an individual. So our whole concept of society was different. And he failed that test because of a different worldview and a different story about a word. So how we give space in classrooms to help students understand their story that they carry with a word and how it might be represented differently is a key activity that we can get involved in. And we can do that with graphic organizers, looking at the connotations we have with words. What might other cultures understand of this word or bring to this text? And so those types of activities that brainstorm or provide a space to explore that is really important, because you then develop other stories of the world through that as a whole class. It's not just to make sure somebody follows a text correctly, if we use that word. So I guess that's a kind of concrete example of that.
Yeah, you made me think, as a person interested in translanguaging, as I told you, that I often think we focus a lot on teaching and learning, but there's comparatively little that has been done in terms of assessment. So how fair is it that we enable the practice of translanguaging in institutional contexts, and then the assessment is very strongly monolingual? What sense does that make, and how helpless a student can feel that in their everyday life and to teach and to learn, that practice is enabled, but then when the moment comes for an actual test, an exam, or any form of assessment, then that practice is not really sustained.
That's right.
And the question of labels, as you said, and how careful we'll need to be. Even the L in EAL, which is language, but when you begin to peel off all the layers, how much more there is than just a language, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, our system is geared to monolingualism, I think, and monoculturalism. And also a term that I keep using recently is monoliteracy, because I think we only see literacy in one way. Whether that's to do with you must read and write in this way, and you must understand the vocabulary in this way. And so we only see one type of literacy as being valued.
Yeah, and as teacher educators, I think also even how students structure the text might really vary a lot from culture to culture. What some cultures go straight to the point when they need to explain something, and others are much more explanatory, and they take their time. So how even the whole, apart from the ideas that we are expressing, the whole way in which we structure the text might really vary so much. And as you said about a student, somebody might fail, might do it poorly because they were educated in another way of structuring big texts, apart from the individual words or the grammar that they use.
Yeah, exactly. It's so important, and we don't realize there's all these layers to being in the classroom. There's all these differences, and those can be quite enriching and exciting. I loved all the difference. I loved the whole way of exploring things in it. And that's not to say that, well, we live in a system that's very structured. The American school system that I worked in is highly structured for testing. You get tested every day. And so, but finding space or creating space within the curriculum was one of the things I made myself do as a teacher, because that brought in the whole social justice aspect. If I'm only giving you a one-sided curriculum that's got only some valuable knowledge or ways of considering education, then I'm doing you a disservice as a teacher, and it's an injustice really when you think of what you're doing. So carving out some of those spaces. And at first I could only do that once every 2 weeks because I had assessments breathing down my neck and I was stuck with certain books I had to use. But I carved out time to bring in other types of texts and other types of activities and literacies. And the kids loved that. It was like a day where they could really explore something different. So they would ask every week, are we doing that today? And so they enjoyed the whole diversity process itself.
Yeah, I'm reading a comment by Frank here, who's watching us. Hello, Frank. It says, great example of intercultural awareness. We often talk about drawing on what the child already knows, but we also need to think more about what we don't know. Otherwise, we will continually produce. Let me see if I can see the end of the comment. Can't. Oh, that's too bad. I can't see the bottom of the comment. I don't know if you can.
Nope. I'm just checking.
Yeah, sorry about that, Frank. Oh, yeah, a curriculum that excludes other perspectives.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I see it now.
Yeah. So, Yvonne, back to NALDIC. I was wondering if, what do you see, maybe related to all these issues that we're talking about, the current challenges, the future challenges of an association that, to some extent, tries to make up for a certain amount of lack of proper training for English as an additional language.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, I hope you don't mind me mentioning here, but the recent kind of Ofsted direction, where it's sought to kind of deprioritize EAL in schools by the taking away the EAL inspector, that speaks volumes to us about where priorities are with the current government. And although we challenge that, and that's part of NALDIC's role, is our activist role, where we challenge the imbalances and the injustices within our system, what they have done is they have flattened, or they've sought to flatten difference, and they've positioned EAL in a way where it's it's deprioritized basically, and the particular way of seeing education that Ofsted promotes has done away with any kind of diversity at all. So I think that's, although they would not say that and recognize that, the whole act in itself has been one to deprioritize. So part of our job as NALDIC exec and as members of that is to kind of push the system to say, here's an issue of justice here that we need to dialogue around. We need to talk about this. Here's why we might be able to do something in a different way. Can we challenge the system in a way that's productive? So that's part of our work, but also working with teachers in schools, offering training. Our conference every year is also an area where professionals can come, students or teachers that have been learning or teaching for a long time can come in and be with us on that day to learn and professionally develop. And then our EAL journal, as you know, and also our new types of adventures like this, which I know you're heading up, Leo, is great. And I think the more we do that, then get our voice out there, then that's going to really help the organisation to continue. But I think that our members have been fantastic They've been with us for a long time, and they support us, and they offer insights into school contexts. They offer support in ways that help the organisation to offer other ways of seeing EAL, and also to bring up issues that are more, I was going to say contemporary, but I mean issues they might be dealing with in their school. And an example of that for NALDIC is, I was chair previously, it was about 8 years ago, I think, but we had a situation where an Ofsted inspector went into a school and said to the school, we are not giving you a satisfactory report, basically, because one of your teachers was allowing their students to use their home language when they should have been using English, and we are not impressed by this. So teachers then got in touch with us. We wrote to Ofsted on their behalf, and we then got a link to start working with them. I asked how they were training their inspectors. And so there was a kind of a catalyst for moving that forward. And I know that Frank was part of that, and Constant taking that forward to help support the Ofsted inspectorate in terms of their own training in EAL. So that's
I know
just
that I
the
don't
kind of
live in
work.
the UK, but from the examples that I hear, I perceive a certain amount of double speak, as it were, where there is talk about inclusion and talk about respecting diversity, but then when the concrete examples are
Yeah.
made manifest, then well, actions speak louder than words, don't they?
Yeah, that's right. So there's lots
Yeah.
of work to do, and we need more teachers and student teachers. And also I would love, one of the things I'd love is if some of the pupils learning English as an additional language would come and talk to us as a committee. So we're wanting people to come and meet with us. It doesn't have to be a commitment for the whole year, but to come and meet with us and talk to us and look at how we can take things forward with associates and friends as well as members.
So if any teachers listening to us have students with English
Yeah.
as an additional language, well, NALDIC is generally open, right, to people approaching us, and
Oh
we've
yeah.
got the special interest groups as well as the regional groups as well, the SIGs and
That's
and
right.
the RIGs. And from the perspective of the journal, of course, we're always interested at the EAL journal that teachers and practitioners, besides researchers, also contact us with ideas
Yeah,
that they might want to contribute. And this is a special year because it's the 30th anniversary of
it is
NALDIC. So surely the big event in November, the conference, is going to be a special one because of the
indeed.
anniversary. I'm not sure we've got the theme yet. Have we got the theme yet for the?
We have, I think it's every teacher is a language teacher.
Right, right.
So there'll be lots of themes that we can take out of that. So if anybody wants to contribute a paper, come and talk and do a session, or just lead something, do a poster, or then we're very open to people getting in touch, and that will come online for people to put their papers in or their abstracts in, so that we can then look at what they could do and how they could contribute.
That's a very strong theme, isn't it? Very broad, and I think it touches on the idea that we need language for every other subject as well. So every
That's
teacher
right.
is a language teacher, means you're doing mathematics, you need to work with the language of mathematics. So maybe teachers working with CLIL, models such as CLIL, content and language integrated learning, might want to also approach us with
That's right.
ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Language is key to everything we do. So in schools, if literacy, language is, that's what literacy is. It's about the language and the discourses that we use, the language we use to get involved in different activities. So it's key to the whole teaching approach that's in schools. So it's really important.
Yeah. Before I ask you, Yvonne, for some final words or a final message, let it be said, this is our second conversation of this kind. We are breaking new ground, and we are hoping that NALDIC can reach out to more people by using the new social media that we've exploited so much in the past couple of years with the pandemic and all the situations that we've had to go through. So that we're looking forward to generating more conversations like this around different themes related to English as an additional language. So I was wondering, Yvonne, if you'd like to finish with a final message, final words of some kind.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for listening. I think when we look at the structures that we have in education, whether it's something that we feel constrains us or something that we feel empowers us, that change happens gradually. And the one thing I took away from Taiwan was that even though I wanted every lesson I taught to have an EAL focus and to be diverse at its core, that change took a long time, and I had to gradually introduce it. And so, as I say to the student teachers that we work with, don't feel discouraged if you're only able to do it a bit at a time in a week's lesson, but that will be something that you can build up and learn and be able to implement, and that eventually, as change happens, that will be something that becomes much more a part of everything that you do, even though when you're working under constraining curricular kind of guidance or curricular expectations, you can make those spaces in order to do the work that you know needs to be done. And that's when it comes back to that phrase that the song of justice must be sung, because I think our lessons take on that theme, and who we are as teachers speaks so much more loudly than anything we will ever do. So if you have it at the core of who you are, your students will know that and understand it and be able to respond to it.
Thank you, Yvonne, for such an interesting conversation. It was really lovely to have listened to you today.
No, thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
We'll be in touch
Okay.
for our work in NALDIC together.
Yeah. See you soon.
Thanks, everybody, for watching.